Hi there, my name's John. I'm from John W. Sports Injury and Physiotherapy. And what I wanted to do was just go through a succinct version of a presentation that I often do for parents, managers, coaches, particularly around youth football, but youth sport in general. We're a physiotherapy company with clinics in Alpington and Bromley, and what really we're looking to do is to provide an extension or as much advice, value that we can provide to the community with some of these tips. And what we look to do in this presentation is cover some of the most common topics that we discuss that we find to be most beneficial for managers, coaches, and parents. So, what are we going to be covering? We're going to be making our way through a few different topics. Firstly, we're going to be talking about warming up. Should we be doing it? How do we do it? What are the important components to remember? The same for cooling down. Do we do a cool down? Are we good at doing cool downs? What are the benefits of doing cool downs? We're then going to talk about a couple of growth related conditions, Osgood Schlatter disease and Sever's disease, and how they may affect the growing footballer, things to watch out for to make sure that we're doing the best that we can in order to prevent those being a problem for our players. And finally, we're going to talk about a little bit around nutrition, hydration before and after matches, as well as a little bit around some basic injury advice to help you when you're pitch side watching your games. So firstly, the warm-up. Now, I break this down into an acronym that I call the PASS method, where we're looking for P, A, S and S. But before we dive into that acronym, firstly what we want to do is understand the purpose of a warm-up. What are we looking to achieve? Well, quite simply, we want to be taking the body from a resting state to a state that is prepared for action, competition, exercise. So we shouldn't be afraid at the end of a warm-up to have a high heart rate, to have our breathing rate going. What we want to be doing is making sure that the body goes progressively up to this state so that we're ready and preparing the body for competition. This will not only help our players to perform well, but also it will reduce the risk of injury. So the first thing that we have to remember is that we want the warm up to be progressive. So we want to be starting at a slow pace and building as the warm up goes through. So we can look to be building intensity with the aim of it culminating in really match specific pace so that the body is prepared to do what it's about to do when it goes onto the pitch. The A stands for agile. Now, what I mean by this is we want to make sure that in the warm up, we're encompassing the three basic movements that the body can do. So, the body can move front and back. We call this moving in the sagittal plane. The body can move from side to side. We call this moving in the frontal plane. And then we can also rotate to what we call the transverse plane. Now, often a lot of injuries, or perhaps the most dramatic movement for the body, is the transverse plane. So, when constructing a warm up, what I think is important to do is to make sure that you're covering all three of those movements. So both front to back, side to side, as well as rotation. Then we come on to stretching. What's most important, dynamic stretching or static stretching? So just as a quick reminder, dynamic stretching is where we're looking to drive the body through quicker movements, sharper movements, whilst also engaging a stretch on the muscle, compared to a static stretch. During a static stretch, what we want to be doing is holding the muscle in an elongated position in order to improve the flexibility or the length of that muscle tissue. Now, really, the key component in a warm-up, with bearing in mind what we're looking to do is prepare the body for competition, we want to be doing dynamic stretching. This is where the dynamic side of things comes in. Now, it's debated about whether static stretching has any benefits, remembering that we're looking to increase the length of the muscle fibers. Now, when our players start competition, that's where the muscles are at their resting length. They haven't yet become short and tight. So the argument is, are we wasting time doing static stretching? Well, for me, if time allows, I would still incorporate that. Even if there isn't the overall physical benefit in terms of preparing the body for competition, what it can do, I think, is help a lot of players psychologically. And I don't think that that should be overlooked. So if you're somebody who likes to do static stretching, I don't discourage that. I just want you to bear in mind that it's something that should be coupled with a good set of dynamic stretching. That should be the main focus. And then one thing that I think is often missed, and again, this really has some benefits around both performance but also injury prevention, is to do some position-specific work. So if you've got your strikers, get them hitting a few shots. Perhaps defenders playing longer passes or clearances, perhaps winning some headers. Midfielders can be doing perhaps shorter, sharper passing, working on their first touch, passing and moving. Again, this will help them prepare for what they're about to do, but it will also help the body to prepare for what it's about to do, and that will have a reduction in the risk of injury. So remembering with our warm-ups, we want to be doing the pass method, and we want to make sure that we're making them progressive, 3 directions of movement, focusing on dynamic stretching, and also encouraging some sport specific, or position specific I should say, work. The cool down. Now, particularly around football, this is something that I feel is missed, and I completely understand that. It's difficult at the end of the game to be completing a cool down sometimes. I always say that there's almost never the right result. If you win a football match, players are all excited, there's some buzzing around. It's something that they don't want to do. If we lose a match, everyone's in that downbeat state, and it's hard to get players to think about the next level. But what we are looking to do, sorry, next level, the next game, I should say. But what we are looking to do with a cool down is we want to take the body from its competition state back to its resting state. Now, this is where we can, in my opinion, have a huge effect on injury prevention. So we really want to do everything from the warm-up in reverse. So a cool down can start towards match-specific pace, but then slowly bring that that pace, that intensity down to a really controlled level. That will allow the heart rate to slowly drop rather than having a dramatic fall off from competition to doing nothing. But for me, the key bit is at this point when we finish a match, our muscles are short, tight, but they're also warm. This is a great time to get into that static stretching, so the opposite of the dynamic stretching that we talked about earlier. Why do I think this is so important? Well, if we imagine the length of a particular muscle is, say, this long as they start the game, as the game progresses, the muscles become shorter and shorter and shorter as they're being contracted and worked. Now, what we can do here is we can leave the player with these short, tight muscles, or we can utilize this opportunity to go for a period of static stretching and look to increase those muscle fiber lengths back to its resting length. This will then be placing less pressure on the joints and reduce our risk of overuse injuries. Then over time, if the players continue that stretching program daily, for example, hopefully what we do is we then increase that resting length of the muscle fibers. Here's where we get our flexibility changes, we get less pressure on the joints that those muscles cross, and we also get more available from that muscle tissue. So that's why I think cooling down is a really, really important part of any player's match day and training day preparations. Something that's really important to do, and we're going to talk a little bit more about overuse injuries as we move this. One of the things that I also get told is we just don't have the time. And I always put it back to managers and coaches, is actually how true is that? For example, if I ask them, do you debrief your players at the end of the match? Do you have a chat with your players? They would all typically say to me, yes, we do. Well, that could be a great time to actually utilize a static stretching protocol so the players can be stretching and delivering this program whilst you're then giving them their debrief. Killing 2 birds with 1 stone, if you like, but it's a great time to fit in a cool down as well. And as I said, static stretching really has an important part to play. So when it comes to warming up and cool downs, another question that I often get asked is, at what age does this become important? What age should we start doing this? Well, whilst there may be varying physical benefits, actually for me, I think you should start as young as possible. Reason being that what we're looking to do here is create a culture, create a repetition pattern that players are used to, that when they arrive for trainings and match days, they know they're going to be completing a warm-up and they understand the benefits of it. We're giving them that education as to why we're doing it. But then also they know that a cool down needs to take place with the same kind of education behind it, understanding that they're now taking the body from their competition. That competition is now finished. We're now winding that down and we're preparing for the next thing, whether it's the next match, the next training session. And we're looking to make sure the body can be in its peak physical performance as they go into that. And by doing a cool down, that's going to support with that. So what I want to do now is move on and talk about some of the key overuse conditions that we might see. And probably the most common one of the growth-related conditions is Osgood Schlatter disease. Now, this is something that typically presents itself in children anywhere between the ages of 12 and 16. What's happening when we get Osgood Schlatter disease? Well, what we see is a pain at the sort of below the knee or the sort of top of the shin bone. So I haven't written that very correctly there, but actually where the pain presents itself is just below the kneecap and that top of the shin bone. We actually have a small lump there, we all would have, and this is the point where your quadricep muscles or the thigh muscles actually cross over the knee and attach. Now, why is that a problem? Why did this occur in youngsters? Well, this part of the bone in youngsters, this bony lump where the quadriceps attach into that we call the tibial tuberosity, is their growth plate. Now, what does this mean? This means that it's not actually turned to bone yet. It's a cartilage structure that grows, allows the bone to grow, and then when we're finished growing, that growth plate turns into bone and it ossifies, or term ossification. But why this becomes a problem in youngsters, particularly ones who are using those quadriceps muscles a lot, so this might be kicking, jumping, sprinting. So we can see straight away why footballers, for example, might be susceptible to these things. But if we're creating a lot of force in that area and those muscles are putting a lot of force on that area below the knee, this soft area might not be strong enough to withstand that, and it can typically cause an irritation. What happens here typically is that players might get some pain at the start of the session, but what we really see, and one of the real signs of it, is that pain increases as the games go on, as training session goes on, as we use those muscles more and it starts pulling away at that knee, we get that soreness. So this can commonly be caused by things like tightness in those quadriceps, if you've lost some flexibility in there. The quadriceps work with the hamstrings, the muscles at the back of the leg. So again, some tightness or dysfunction in those, and they can cause an imbalance, causing this pressure at the knee. Or a weakness at the hip. If we're weak at the hip, that can cause some pressure to radiate down towards that knee and create that soreness. Now, it was often thought about growing pains that we had two options. One, you can either just play through it and it will go away with growth, or two, that we just go away and rest for a long period of time. Now, I don't actually agree with either of those points. I think that we need to treat this condition with the respect that it deserves. And as soon as we identify somebody who may be suffering of Osgood Schlatter disease, we need to be designing an individual personalised rehabilitation program for them. So we want to understand at what stage they're at, and therefore we want to provide the correct exercises and rehabilitation techniques and treatments in order to get them back. This may mean a period of rest, but what we want to be doing is encouraging them to get back to sport and exercise and certain tasks as quickly as possible, appropriate to the stage of injury that they may have. So very common. It's reported to affect at least around 20% of people, growing athletes, particularly ones who are playing a lot, playing a high intensity, or maybe going through some changes in growth. So very common, but for me, we want to get rid of the old school thought of just playing through it, because that will become too irritable. We don't want to rest for longer than we need to, because what we're not doing, what the crucial thing that we have to do with these growth-related conditions is to correct the cause. And that is the key thing, finding out the cause to get rid of what's causing the pain. Now, another similar condition is called Sever's disease. This affects children a little bit younger, typically, perhaps between the ages of about 8 and 12, but can be a little bit older than that. It's very similar in the fact that it's a big, powerful group of muscles pulling at a growth plate. But this growth plate is now in the heel of the child, and the problem being the calf muscles pulling into that heel. So that heel bit at the back there is soft, it's the growth plate, it's not strong enough to withstand this force. So again, if we're running around a lot, pounding a lot of work through those heels, that can cause this pain. And what we might typically see, similar to Osgood Schlatters, is that the more we're using it, the more the pain grows. We might typically see children having to walk around on their tiptoes, not able to put their heels down. And again, the key thing is identifying this early, understanding what's causing the pain, and then making sure that we are providing appropriate rehabilitation exercises. And these might typically be establishing what areas are tight, or again, if there's a weakness at the ankle, a lack of strength that we need to be improving, providing the perfect exercises to get our players back onto the pitch nice and quickly. But my overall message for these growth-related conditions is, as soon as they're suspected, that we want them to be addressed nice and quickly, because that's the quickest way to get people back. It can be difficult to judge how long it's going to take, because we're dealing with nature here and every child is perhaps at a different stage of their growth. But what we do know is with the appropriate exercises, we can get people back onto the pitch as quickly as possible. One thing that I wanted to briefly touch upon as well, and this is particularly affecting children around 13 to 16, this is a period that we call adolescent awkwardness. And this is a stage in any child's life where their growth can really start to accelerate, can happen dramatically. And we know that this can have some big effects upon the growing frame. The reason I mention this is probably two things that we might expect to see during this stage. It could be that firstly, we start to see an increase in the likelihood of injury. And secondly, we may see a reduction in performance. So again, that's something to consider. And again, particular studies that I've carried out has found that this period is very difficult for children to continue the increase in performance that we would expect to see. So things to factor in as managers and coaches, coupled with the fact that at this age, it's really important to be aware of doing everything we can to prevent these overuse issues occurring. So monitoring flexibility, monitoring strength, having good warm-ups, having good cool-downs in place. And so just a little bit to talk about nutrition and hydration. Firstly, before the game. Now, before the game, we just want to be considering when it comes to our nutrition that carbohydrate is our important food group. So keeping things nice and simple, it's where we want to be taking on carbohydrate to give our body more energy available to it when we come to performance. So this might be eating your pastas, your potatoes, taking in some sort of simple sugars, but just having to think about, can we have pasta the night before a game, for example? Something that we know gives us more carbohydrates, so we're going to have more energy available to us. But something that I also think is really important is to allow time for the body to digest. So often when I've been around football matches, you see players perhaps eating difficult foods to digest. So it might be a sausage roll as they're arriving, about to do a warm-up and things like this. I think we want to be allowing at least 2 hours for complex foods, if you like, to be digested. Now, if it's something light, a light sugary snack, a banana, things like this that we might have before the game, that's going to be okay to do. But your bigger meals, your breakfast, your lunch, if that's required, we want to be allowing a couple of hours for that to be digested before performance. And again, hydration is also something that's going to be very important before a game. We want to be well hydrated. One note pre-game that I think is worth discussing is the fact that probably water is going to be as effective as anything else. I know there's certain sort of sports drinks and things like Lucozade that might be advertised as being really helpful to give us energy. Those things, yes, will help to hydrate, but they also have a lot of sugars and electrolytes and things which are there to be replacing the electrolytes that we're losing during competition through things like sweat. So before a game, though, probably our best bet is to go with water. And then as game progresses, during the game, that's where we can start taking on these electrolyte-based drinks and also getting salt and potassium into our bodies. That's going to help to prevent cramp. So things like bananas can be very helpful to do that, or some of these electrolyte-based drinks, things like Lucozade, may be helpful to prevent from muscle cramps as well. But an important note around hydration is that we don't want to be consuming those fluids too quickly. If we take on things in abundance, our body's just going to react by ejecting those from our system via urine and things. So we want to be taking these fluids on slowly and consistently in terms of the build up to sport and competition. So how do things change post-game, after a game? How do we support our recovery once we've performed? Well, this is where the important food group shifts a little bit from carbohydrates into protein. Now, protein is there to help us grow and repair damaged muscle tissue. So if we have been competing and we want to start thinking our mindset shifts to the next training session, the next performance, bringing protein into the body can be really helpful. Now, there are things like protein shakes. Unofficial protein shakes, things like chocolate milk, can be a very helpful source of protein and perhaps easily available and easily digestible and good for youngsters and things. When I say good, a good source of protein. But also, again, changing our diet for foods that are going to give us more protein. So your chickens, turkeys, eggs, pulses, these types of things, whatever that we can take to increase the amount of protein that we're getting into our bodies. We're seeing the importance of protein spoken about more and more in the media. A lot of the conventional chocolate bars now tend to have like a protein version, like a Mars bar protein version, where they're getting more protein into the body designed for afterwards. So that's something that's going to be really important. And hydration is still, and in fact, if not more important, more vital. Our body's going to be in a dehydrated state. So we need to understand that we need to be drinking much more fluid than we would do on a normal day in order to rehydrate ourselves. So we want to be getting water on to rehydrate, but also, as I mentioned, we can look to take these electrolyte-based drinks in order to supplement what we may have lost whilst we've been competing. So simple things to remember is that carbohydrate before competition, protein following competition. We want to be making sure that we're getting fluid on before, but water is a great source for that. And then post game, we want to carry on with that water, but we can actually start getting some electrolytes and other based drinks back in at this time during or post competition to replace what we might have been losing through sweat. And then the final thing that I wanted to talk about was really just around some basic injury advice, questions that I might often get asked that I think may be applicable for you on the sidelines watching as coaches, managers and parents. Really, this is around hot versus cold. One of the common things come up, should I use hot, should I use cold? And it's something that's greatly debated, even amongst physiotherapists. But for me, I like to keep things simple and think about the purpose. We know that heat is going to encourage a blood supply. It's going to look to lubricate tight muscles and get more blood to the area. Cold is going to do the opposite. What we're looking to do with cold is to actually calm a blood supply. So this is what we use for anti-inflammatory purposes. So if somebody has rolled an ankle, we know that the body is going to send a big inflammatory response there. It's going to cause swelling. What we don't want to do is heat that area and encourage more blood flow. That's where we might be looking to use cold in order to calm the area down. So if we think of players that come off even in things like Premier League games, what they would typically be looking to do is get some ice on there in order to calm down that inflammatory response. Where we might be thinking about using heat in a sort of match day example is perhaps before a game. If somebody's got a tight muscle and they want to make that feel a little bit looser, encourage a blood supply there, that's when heat comes into play. But generally speaking, injuries sustained during performance, we want to be thinking about getting cold. I also think that it's important to consider sometimes the mechanism of injury in order to prevent long-term injury. Now, I appreciate we're not trying to help everybody be physios and make these decisions, but if we see somebody who perhaps, for example, rolls an ankle and we suspect, they pull up with some pain, but then that pain eases and they carry on performing. What we need to consider here is things like the release of adrenaline that would have happened, things that could be masking that pain, and perhaps just considering that if they've damaged the area a little bit, but adrenaline's now kicking in, by carrying on playing, we could be doing further damage. We could be taking a grade 1 sprain into a more significant sprain that's going to result in longer time away from sport or competition. So sometimes it's more sensible to take a short sort of step back in terms of coming off of the pitch and have a break for the remainder of that game in order to not take a huge, long, sort of bigger step back in the future by having to have more games out. And again, if we know that players have been injured, just being sensible with their return. So when they come back from injury into training, we want to consider about the task that they're undertaking. If they've had a muscle strain, do we want them to be doing shooting and sprinting, for example, in their first session back? Or could we focus more on technique-based work with them and perhaps slower jogging to start building some fitness? And again, talking to them, and this may be talking to parents or players, just about the volume that they're doing. If they've been out for a period of time, 2 to 3 weeks, for example, and they're used to playing 4 sessions a week, in their first week back, should they be doing 4 sessions? Or could we do 1 session to see how that goes and build it back in? Just trying to make small things to really prevent the risk of either making injuries more significant or for reoccurrence of injuries that have taken place. I think for me, what I wanted to do in this video was make some points nice and simply for you, some key bits of advice that I think may be helpful for you. But the key for me is with any questions, do feel free to reach out to us. Take our details, ping me an email, give us a call. You're more than welcome to always pop into any of our clinics and we can happily settle any questions that you may have for you so that you can be doing your job to the best of your abilities.